Thank you, Supreet. So I'm taking A-level economics and I'm planning on minoring in econ when I go to university alongside my major of political science.
Oh, wow, great. It's really good to have you with us. Today, we are also joined by jaw breaking, jaw dropping hosts Zumar Sheikh, Zohaan Rana, and Mr. Mohammed Ariful Kabir. So, before we
Greetings,
go,
everyone.
oh, greetings.
Thank
So,
you so much
before
for welcoming me onto the podcast again, Supreet.
So, before we move into specific cities, I think it's worth stepping back and grounding the discussion in a more fundamental question. Because when we talk about a housing crisis, we often jump straight to prices, but that doesn't fully explain what's actually going on. Housing markets are shaped by both supply and demand, but also by policy, incentives, and expectations. And in many cases, those forces don't align in a way that produces affordable outcomes. So, why is housing becoming unaffordable, and who is responsible in New York? To start us off, Mr. Zumar Sheikh, would you like the torch?
I would love to light the torch. Thank you so much for giving me said torch. Before I begin, I would just like to say our other co-host Demir Hossain is currently at an international event, sporting event, playing football, representing our school in India. So you guys at home, please give a round of applause for Demir. Without further ado, let's get started for New York City. Housing has become increasingly unaffordable because of demand, um, as it's rising much faster than supply. But the real issue is how policy, market forces, and political choices interact. The city continues to attract high-income workers, global investors, and corporations, which drives up demand and pushes prices higher. Yet, new housing constructions remains limited due to zoning laws, building restrictions, and slow approval processes. This raises a key debate. Is the crisis mainly a supply constraint where not enough housing is being built, or a case of excess demand, fueled by wealth concentration and speculative investment? Politicians such as Zoran Mamdani argue that the system itself is flawed, emphasizing how housing should be treated as a right and calling for stronger rent regulations and public housing expansions. However, critics counter these same regulations. While designed to protect tenants and communities from displacement, it can also limit growth by disencouraging developers from building new units. This leads to another tension where are regulations actually protecting residents or unintentionally worsening the shortage? Ultimately, high housing prices tend to benefit property owners, landlords, and real estate investors whose assets increased in value, while renters and middle class residents bear the cost. The result in a system where housing is no longer just a basic necessity, but a high value asset shaped by both market demand and political decision making, leaving large parts of the population priced out. So, moving forward, I want to pass the torch to our guest speaker, Amelia, here. Do you think that the real solution lies in building more housing, or is it fundamentally changing how the housing market itself operates? Amelia, would you like to talk about this now?
I think the real answer is both, but most people frame it wrong. They treat it as either or when actually supply has to come first, but it only works if you fix the system that's blocking supply in the first place. You can't actually regulate your way out of physical storage. For example, if there are like 10 people competing for 5 apartments, rent control doesn't create a sixth apartment. It just determines who wins the fight. So, yes, you do have to build more. The research is clear that even building expensive housing eventually frees up cheaper housing down the chain. But the deeper problem, and is the reason we're not building enough, isn't a mystery. It's a political choice. Zoning laws, approval delays, development fees, all of this exists because people who already own homes benefit financially from scarcity. Their wealth literally depends on there not being enough housing. So the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as homeowners designed it. The real question we should be asking isn't supply or reform, it's what is housing for? The moment we started treating it primarily as an investment vehicle rather than infrastructure like roads or schools, we guaranteed this crisis. So you can't really solve a problem when the people with political power have a financial incentive to keep it unsolved. My answer is that you have to build aggressively, but simultaneously, you have to change the rules that made scarcity profitable in the first place. One without the other is either bailing a boat without patching the hole or patching the hole while standing in 6 feet of water.
Amelia, that was beautifully well said. Thank you so much for your expert input here. Araf, I just want to ask you a question now, diving into Amelia's response here and previously what I said about my question. Are policies such as rent control actually solving a problem or just delaying a deeper structural issue? What do you have to say about this, Araf?
Yeah, thank you for the prompt, Zumar. I actually think policies solve the housing crisis, and I feel like they also do both. They delay it and solve it because rent control and rent stabilization keep housing affordable for existing tenants, which prevents sudden rent spikes and displacement, which provides overall stability, especially for like lower and middle income residents. So in the short run, they absolutely solve a real problem for the people already living there. But but another problem arises from this, which is landlords earn less, which gives less incentive to build or maintain housing, and developers avoid building rental units, and new supply slows down. And not only that, there's also fewer available units from this problem, where the overall market rents rise. So while some people say stay protected, others face even higher prices and fewer options. So I would say like a balanced conclusion for your prompt would be like rent control doesn't fix the housing crisis. It just like manages the symptoms, or like does it well in the short run. So yeah.
Araf, thank you so much. I just want to ask you one just small question here. Due to all of these like houses and apartments, the price increasing or rent increasing, why do we see that New York's population isn't decreasing, but it's actually increasing now?
That's a pretty insightful prompt you gave me, Zumar. I actually think while the population is still like increasing and housing is so expensive, it's kind of contradictory, but like it kind of makes sense if you look at the bigger picture, because New York obviously is like it has like high paying jobs for like finance, tech, and media. There's also like career growth and global exposure that make people want to pay more to earn more and still want to move in. There's also like many other factors that play into this, like New York offering things you can't easily like replicate. For example, like the culture, or like being in the center of everything. And even though if lower income residents may leave from the place, higher income residents can replace them, and like population can stay stable from this. And the only thing that changes is the type of people and the income they have. So like New York keeps growing not because it's like affordable, it's just because the opportunities it offers and how valuable it is to the people who are willing to pay the price. That's it.
Araf, that was beautifully said by you. Thank you so much. And I just want to go back to what you said about wealthy residents living there or potential investors coming to New York. I just want to ask a question to everyone in this podcast and the viewers at home listening right now. How much of New York's housing market is driven by people who want to live there versus those who actually want to see a property that they want to invest in? Zohan, let's hear an answer from you.
I think I'm gonna take the torch on this one, gentlemen and woman. That was a beautiful question by our co-host Zumar Sheikh. So, and I would love to answer it. So, in New York City, most housing demand still comes from people who actually want to live there, driven by jobs, education, and lifestyle opportunities. This keeps the market strong and ensures high occupancy. However, investment demand plays a significant role, especially in the luxury market, where properties are often bought as assets rather than homes. Even if investors are not the majority, they still push the prices up and influence what gets built. So overall, real demand dominates, but investment activity has a disproportionate impact on prices and affordability across the market in New York City. New York is known as the hub for the global economy. To what extent does foreign investment contribute to rising housing prices?
Thank you for the question, Zohan. So I think foreign investment is significant, but it's more targeted than people think. It doesn't inflate the whole market, it inflates the top of the market, and then that pressure trickles down. Because when you think about it, foreign buyer activity in New York doubled this year in early 2025 compared to the year before. This was driven heavily by Chinese investors fleeing a collapsing property market back in China. And iconic towers like 432 Park Avenue and Central Park Tower were built almost entirely with international buyers in mind. These aren't homes, they're safety deposit boxes for the people who are migrating into New York. And the telling detail of this is that 75% of Manhattan condo transactions in late 2025 were all cash purchases, an all time high. And that's not people buying homes to live in, that's wealth parking itself. And crucially, there are no additional stamp duties on foreign buyers in New York, unlike London or Singapore, which have specifically taxed overseas investors to cool the market. The deeper issue is what New York actually represents to global wealth. Foreign investors treat Manhattan as a hedge against inflation, political instability, currency volatility, and essentially the same reason people buy gold. So when China's economy wobbles or the UK gets uncertain, that money flows into Manhattan apartments. New York's housing crisis is partly a side effect of being the world's most trusted safe haven. Um, oh, okay. Zumar, I have a question for you. Even if foreign investment pushes prices up, does restricting it solve the problem or just ignore deeper structural issues in the housing market?
Now, that really is a complex question that Miss Murad herself has asked me here, and I am very honored to ask this question, to answer this question on behalf of everyone in this podcast. Thank you for giving me the opportunity here. The way I see it is that even if foreign investments do push higher prices in New York City, restricting it is unlikely to solve the housing crisis on its own, as it mainly targets a visible source of demand rather than the underlying structural issues. Foreign buyers make up relatively a small a share of the total transactions, so limiting them might slightly reduce speculative demand or vacant luxury units. But I don't think it doesn't address the core problem here, which is the chronic undersupply of housing, which is caused by caused by zoning restrictions, limited high density development, and slow construction approvals. In many cases, foreign investments is more of an amplifier than a root cause, entering a market that is already constrained. Additionally, focusing too heavily on foreign buyers can distract policymakers from deeper issues such as domestic inequality, where high income local buyers and investors also drive up prices, and without increasing housing supply or reforming urban planning policies, demand, whether it's foreign or domestic, will continue to outpace available housing. So while restrictions on foreign investments may have short-term political appeals, they risk oversimplifying the question and ignoring the structural imbalances that actually sustain high housing costs. I think we've talked enough about New York here. Supreet, I think we should transition on to Toronto now. What do you think?
For sure. Thank you for that amazing suggestion, Mr. Sheikh. And overall, I wanted to thank our hosts as well as our guest speaker, Miss Murad, as well as our host, Mr. Sheikh. And let's begin. So, what we see in New York is a combination of strong demand, structural supply constraints, and the influence of global capital, all contributing to rising prices and limited accessibility. But what's interesting is that this isn't unique to long established global cities, because if we shift our focus to a city like Toronto, we start to see a similar affordability crisis, but driven by a somewhat different set of forces. Unlike New York, this housing pressure has emerged much more rapidly, particularly over the past decade, and a large part of that has been driven by immense, rapid, unprecedented population growth, especially through immigration. alongside a surge in demand for housing that supply has struggled to keep up with. At the same time, Toronto has also seen increasing levels of investment activity in the housing market, raising questions about the role of speculation, expectations of rising prices, and whether housing is being treated more as an asset than a place to live. So, while the outcome may look similar, rising prices and declining affordability, the underlying drivers may be quite different, and that makes this city a really interesting case to examine. So I know, Mr. Zohan, you have your brother studying there. So I was just wondering, how significant is the role of immigration in driving housing demand, and is it being matched by adequate housing development?
It is my honor to introduce Toronto for this podcast and this question. So thank you, Supreet, for starting that introduction, and I'll begin right now. So in Toronto, the housing crisis is largely driven by a clear imbalance between demand and supply. Rapid population growth, especially through immigration, has significantly increased the demand for housing, while construction has not kept pace. This creates a demand shock where more people are competing for limited housing, pushing prices upward and making homes increasingly unaffordable, particularly for the middle class trying to enter the market. A similar pattern can be observed in New York City, where strong demand also drives high prices, but in that case, the issue is more closely tied to strict zoning laws that limit the expansion of supply, which was mentioned a few minutes ago before by our esteemed guest speaker. However, it is important to add nuance. Immigration itself is not the root cause, but rather a factor that exposes deeper structural issues. The real problem lies in policy and planning failures that have limited the responsiveness of housing supply. In Toronto, zoning restrictions, slow approval processes, and insufficient long term planning have contributed to a supply lag, much like in New York City, where regulations also constrain development. At the time, speculation plays a major role in both cities. Housing is increasingly treated as an investment asset, with investors purchasing multiple properties, which reduces the availability of homes for actual residents and further drives up prices. In response, the government has introduced measures such as taxes, regulations, and incentives aimed at improving affordability. However, these have had limited success as they often fail to address the core structural imbalance between supply and demand. This mirrors the situation in New York, where despite policy efforts, affordability remains a major issue due to persistent demand and restricted supply. This raises key questions. Is immigration truly driving the crisis, or is it being used as a scapegoat? To what extent is speculative demand inflating prices? And can policy realistically resolve such a deeply rooted issue? These questions help transition to a different context, moving from developed markets like Toronto and New York to a developing megacity like Mumbai, which we'll be talking about later. So the floor is open to all our co-hosts and our esteemed guests to answer the question. Araf, I see you have raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Zohan, for opening the floor. I just want to say, when we look at Toronto's housing market, one of the most important and also most controversial factors is immigration. I don't think we should overlook this topic because over the past decade, Canada has pursued one of the highest immigration intakes among developing countries, which has played a key role in supporting economic growth and labor demand. However, most new arrivals tend to settle in major urban cities like Toronto, where jobs, education, and infrastructure are concentrated. This has a sharp and sustained increase in housing demand within a relatively short period of time. And also at the same time, housing construction has not expanded at the same pace, leading to rising prices and increasing pressure on both the renters and the buyers. So this kind of brings us to a deeper policy debate about how cities should respond to rapid population growth. I actually have a question for the guest speaker, which is, if immigration is a key driver of housing demand in Toronto, do you think the real issue is population growth itself, or the inability of housing systems and policies to adapt quickly enough to that growth? And in that case, should the focus be on limiting demand or fundamentally accelerating the supply? Please answer the question. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Araf. So my honest answer is that population growth is not the problem. The problem is that Toronto's housing system moves at the speed of bureaucracy, while population grows at the speed of a federal immigration target. The data actually makes this clear. In Toronto, net immigration surged more than 15-fold between 2005 and 2022, yet the housing prices rose unevenly, not in lockstep with that growth. If immigration were the primary driver, you'd see a straight line, and you don't. What you see instead is a city that's simply never built enough homes, in good times or bad. The Greater Toronto Area needs over 50,000 new units annually to meet growing demand, but only around 40,000 have been completed each year, a shortfall of 10,000 units every single year, compounding over time, and that gap existed long before the recent immigration surge. Immigration didn't break the system, it exposed a system that was already broken. And here's what makes limiting demand particularly self-defeating for Toronto specifically. Immigrants make up 19% of the construction labor force and 40% of all civil engineers in Canada. So the people being scapegoated for the demand problem are literally the same people you need to solve the supply problem. Cutting immigration to cool housing demand is like firing your builders because you don't have enough buildings. So no, the focus should not be on limiting demand. It should be on making the supply system move as fast as the city grows. That means cutting 20-month approval timelines, reforming zones, reducing development fees that add up to $90,000 per home, and treating housing construction the way you treat any national infrastructure emergency, with urgency and not committees. I have a follow-up question for Zohaan Rana. If we know that the system is already broken, as I stated, and we know what needs to change, why hasn't it? Who actually benefits from keeping Toronto's housing supply restricted?
Beautifully asked question, and it is my honor to answer it. So I'll begin right now. Because the issue isn't just economical, it's about incentives and political pressure as well. In Toronto, even though increasing supply seems like the obvious solution, not everyone benefits from that change. Existing homeowners are some of the biggest winners from restricted supply. When housing is limited, price rises, increasing the value of their property and overall wealth. As a result, many oppose new developments in their neighborhoods. Local governments also benefit indirectly since higher property values lead to higher property tax revenues. At the same time, developers and investors can profit from a constrained market, as high prices make projects, especially luxury housing, more profitable. So the system hasn't changed because those who benefit from high prices and limited supply have strong incentives to maintain the status quo, while those most affected, renters and future buyers, often have less political influence. I would like to answer. I would like to ask a question to our esteemed co-host, Mr. Zumar Sheikh. In Toronto, to what extent is the housing crisis driven by inelastic supply versus rising demand?
Thank you so much for handing the mic over to me. I would be honored, and I am very happy to answer your question here. But before I answer, I would just like to say to everyone watching at home and our guest speaker and co-hosts that don't know this information, Zohan actually lived in Toronto for about 3 years during COVID. So I think this was the most perfect opportunity for him to speak about Toronto itself and ask me this question. So thank you so much, Zohan, for giving me such a beautiful question. In Toronto, the housing crisis is driven by both rising demand and supply constraints, but the more dominant factor is the inelasticity of supply. Demand has clearly increased due to immigration, population growth, and strong job opportunities, which naturally puts upward pressure on prices. However, in well-functioning market, supply should expand to meet the demand. In Toronto, this adjustment is slow and limited because housing supply is relatively inelastic in the short term to medium term. Due to zoning restrictions, limited land use flexibility, lengthy approval processes, and construction bottlenecks. This means that even small increases in demand can lead to disproportionately large increases in price. So while raising demand acts as the trigger, It is the lack of responsive supply that turns this into a sustained affordability crisis. Without addressing these structural supply rigidness, pressures will continue to translate directly into higher housing costs rather than increased housing availability. Now, I just want to ask a question to our guest speaker and our expert in all three cities, Toronto, Mumbai, and New York, Miss Amelia Murad. Um, and the question is, if demand continues to rise due to immigration and economic growth, does the failure lie in the scale of population inflows or in the inability of urban planning systems to efficiently reallocate land and increase density?
Thank you for the question, Zumar. I would say that the failure is almost entirely in the planning system, and Toronto is one of the clearest examples of this anywhere in the world. If you look at the math, development approvals in Toronto currently average 20 months, and the fees and delays attached to that process add between 43,000 and 90,000 to the cost of every single new home. That's not a demand problem. That's a system that is structurally incapable of responding to growth at any speed. And the land reallocation question is where it gets really demanding. In the 240 largest North American metro areas, height restrictions limit construction to just 2 or 3 stories on 60% of residential land, and only 7% of all residential land allows buildings of 5 stories or more. Toronto sits inside that same logic. Enormous amounts of land within the city are zoned exclusively for single-family homes. And in one of the most undersupplied housing markets on earth, that's not scarcity of land, that's a political choice to keep land artificially underused. So Toronto's problem isn't that too many people want to live there, it's that the city has built a planning system optimized for the 1950s and never fundamentally updated it. Population growth didn't cause this crisis, it just made it impossible to hide the crisis.
Beautifully said by our esteemed guest speaker, Miss Amelia Murad. Just before we transition to the topic of Mumbai and its housing crisis, I've been itching to ask this question to our esteemed co host, Mr. Araf Kabir. So, to what extent do price signals in Toronto's housing market fail to allocate resources efficiently due to the combined effects of speculation, regulatory constraints, and housing's dual role as both a consumption good and a financial asset? And what does this imply about the limits of the free market in achieving affordability in Toronto?
Thank you, Zohan, for that prompt. I believe that in Toronto's housing market, price signals don't fully translate into efficient outcomes because, in theory, rising prices should encourage more construction and eventually balance supply and demand. But several factors disrupt this process because speculation is one major issue, and many properties are purchased as investments rather than for living, which pushes prices up without increasing actual housing availability. At the same time, zoning restrictions, land use rules, and slow approval processes limit how quickly new supply can respond. On top of that, housing has a dual role in Toronto. It is both of basic necessity and a financial asset. So prices are driven not just by demand for living space, but also by investment flows and expectations of future appreciation. As a result, I think instead of correcting shortages, the market often reinforces high prices. And this suggests that free market mechanisms alone may not be enough to ensure affordability without meaningful policy intervention. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kabir. It's very insightful as usual. And thank you to the rest of the hosts. It was absolutely astounding. So, what we see in Canada and Toronto specifically is a housing market under pressure from rapid population growth. And in New York, we have seen the rising demand. And in both of these cities, we have seen how supply is struggling to keep pace. And all of this leads to a sharp decline in affordability, particularly for the middle and lower income classes. But even in a city like Toronto, despite raising rising prices, the issue is still largely framed around affordability within a formal housing market. And if we, sorry, just having internet issues. Okay, sorry, viewers. There was a timer set on the meeting. It was just ringing and just disturbed us all. So, if we shift our focus to a city like Mumbai, the conversation changes quite significantly. Because in Mumbai, the housing crisis isn't just about rising prices, it's about the access to the formal housing itself. Because we see that a substantial portion of the population is living in informal housing, including slums, especially the Dharavi slums, the biggest slums in the entire world, due to a lack of affordable alternatives. And that introduces a completely different dimension to the discussion. Yes, it is true there are slums in New York, slums in Toronto, but there's a big difference in those slums and the slums in Mumbai. And we know how Mumbai is one of the most densely populated cities in the world, with severe land constraints and extremely high demand concentrated in a relatively small geographic area. But unlike New York or Toronto, the informal settlements are more apparent and it becomes a structural part of the housing system. And to put this in perspective, in cities like New York, average monthly rent for a one bedroom apartment can easily exceed $3,000 to $4,000. In Toronto, that figure is typically around $2,000 to $2,500. Whereas in Mumbai, uh, average rents are significantly lower in absolute terms, often ranging between $300 to $800 depending on the area. But that comparison in reality is extremely misleading because when you adjust for income levels, the relative cost of housing in Mumbai can be just as, if not more, burdensome, especially given the limited availability of formal housing and limited land. And this raises an extremely interesting question to Mr. Ariful Kabir. Why does Mumbai's housing system continue to produce housing that remains inaccessible to large segments of the population, while also including luxurious finishes, luxurious features, and increasing the cost of the housing rather than resolving the underlying issue of success?
Thank you, Supreet, for the prompt. I kind of agree with you how Mumbai is like sort of like a narrow peninsula, so usable land is like naturally limited. Mumbai's housing system continues to produce housing that is out of reach for a large share of its population because the problem is not just demand. It is a deep structural mismatch between land, income, planning, and like incentives. So as population grows, land prices rise sharply, which pushes development toward high-end luxury apartments. And this means new housing is often built for the top income segment and not the majority. And on top of that, a large share of Mumbai's workforce earns lower informal incomes, while housing prices reflect high land costs, urban demand pressures, and investment driven development. The result is a massive gap between what people earn and what housing costs. And yeah, I just think that Mumbai doesn't fail because housing isn't just being built, it fails because the housing that is built is shaped by land scarcity, inequality, and profit incentives rather than broad affordability needs. So yeah.
Araf, thank you so much for your response to Supreet's question here. I think now we should ask a question that I've been eagerly waiting to ask, leeching off your response here to our guest speaker, Miss Amelia Murad. Do informal settlements exist because the housing system has failed or because they're the only mechanism through which the system can continue to function?
Hello, Miss Amelia Murad.
Thank you for the question, Zumar. So that's one of the most important reframes in urban planning, and the honest answer is both, but for reasons that make the housing system look far more cynical than it admits. The conventional story is that informal settlements are a failure, a symptom of a system overwhelmed by migration and poverty. But there's a compelling counterargument that they're actually a pressure valve that the system quietly depends on. In Mumbai, Dharavi alone generates over $500 million in annual economic activity, with 80% of its population both living and working within its boundaries. That's not a failed community, that's a functioning economy that the formal city extracts enormous wealth from, while refusing to formally house the people producing. Think about what informal settlements actually do for the formal economy. They house the construction workers, the domestic workers, the street vendors, the delivery drivers, the entire labor force that keeps a city like Mumbai or Toronto, surrounding regions operational. If you remove them without replacing that housing, the formal economy would collapse within weeks. So the question becomes, is the system failing to house these people, or has it made a quiet calculation that not housing them is cheaper? Because formal housing costs money, and in land and approvals and infrastructure, informal settlements cost the system almost nothing, while delivering enormous economic returns. The uncomfortable truth is that informal settlements exist at the intersection of both answers. They are evidence of failure, they are also a feature, not a bug, of how cities manage the cost of growth. I'd like to turn the question around on Zumar. If informal settlements are effectively subsiding the formal economy, who is actually responsible for that bargain? Is it governments, developers, or are we as consumers of cheap goods and services all complicit in it?
Now, that is a very good question asked by Miss Amelia Murad. We can see that it is evident that she did actually get an A star on her O levels economics exam with an 89 out of 90 with this question. And I am so grateful you asked me this question, because honestly, I think I am quite the expert in Mumbai, as I've been there multiple times and I have a couple of properties there. Without further ado, let's answer that question. In Mumbai, if formal settlements are effectively subsidizing the formal economy by providing low-cost labor and keeping urban services affordable, then responsibility for that quote-unquote bargain is shared across multiple actors rather than resting in a single group. Governments play a role by failing to provide sufficient affordable housing, or by maintaining policies that make formal housing inaccessible while still relying on the economic productivity that informal workers generate. Developers contribute by prioritizing high-margin projects instead of housing that meets the needs of lower-income populations, reinforcing the gap between supply and accessibility. At the same time, businesses benefit from lower labor costs made possible by informal housing, and consumers indirectly gain from cheaper goods and services. This creates a system where the costs of urban growth are effectively shifted onto those living in informal settlements, while the benefits are distributed more widely. So rather than being the result of one actor's decisions, the persistence of this system reflects on a broader structure of incentives, which raises the uncomfortable question: if everyone benefits in the same way, is there actually enough incentive within the system to change it? Now, that I don't think personally is a question that we should be answering, as it's not a very complex or deep enough question. I would like to ask another similar but more in-depth question to our guest speaker. However, she has had a lot of questions on her plate in this episode. Therefore, I would like to shift a more personal question to Zohaan Rana here of, to what extent do informal settlements represent a market failure in housing provisions versus an alternative equilibrium where the formal system relies on informality to sustain urban productivity? Please answer this question, Zohaan Rana. Thank you so much.
That's absolutely a beautiful and insightful question from our HL economics student, Mr. Zumar Sheikh, who recently got a 14 out of 15 on his question paper 1B exam. So thank you very much, Zumar. So to answer Zumar's very insightful question is, in Mumbai, informal settlements can be understood both as a market failure and as an alternative equilibrium, and the reality lies somewhere in between. On one hand, they clearly reflect a failure of the housing market. Prices in the formal sector are far above what a large share of the population can afford, meaning the price mechanism fails to allocate housing efficiently. This is worsened by supply side constraints such as strict zoning laws, slow approvals, and limited of affordable housing development. As a result, a large portion of the population is excluded from formal housing altogether, which contradicts the idea of an efficient market outcome. On the other hand, informal settlements also function as sort of a adaptive equilibrium. They provide low-cost housing close to economic opportunities, allowing workers to remain in the city and contribute to its productivity. In this sense, the formal economy indirectly depends on informality. Many essential workers rely on these settlements to survive in a high costing city. Without them, labor costs would rise significantly, potentially reducing overall economic efficiency. So while informal housing appears inefficient, it actually sustains the broader urban system. A realistic solution must address both sides of this issue. Simply removing informal settlements would disrupt the labor market, while ignoring them perpetuates inequality. The most effective approach is integrated upgrading and reform. Governments should invest in improving informal areas, better sanitation, infrastructure, and legal recognition, while simultaneously expanding the supply of affordable formal housing through zoning reform, faster approvals, and incentives for lower cost development. Over time, this allows informal settlements to transition into formal, livable communities without displacing residents. This approach acknowledges that informality currently plays a functional role, but aims to gradually replace it with a more equitable and efficient housing system.
Zohan, thank you so much for your input on this.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much once again. Araf, I just want to ask you a question here since you are the expert in this Mumbai part of this episode. If informal housing enables economic participation by lowering living costs, would fully formalizing the system actually improve welfare or risk excluding the very populations it aims to support?
Thank you for the question, Zumar. I think in a city like Mumbai, informal housing exists largely because it provides something the formal system currently struggles to offer, which is affordable access to the city. It allows low-income populations to live close to jobs and economic activity, even if conditions are not ideal. And because of this, informal housing is not just a failure of planning. In many ways, it has become a practical response to high costs and limited formal supply. However, if the entire system were fully formalized, it could significantly improve living standards through better infrastructure, sanitation, legal protection, and long-term security tenure. These are clear welfare gains, and at the same time, this is an important risk. Formalization often comes with higher costs and stricter regulations, and if not carefully managed, it can unintentionally make housing less affordable and even displace the very communities it is meant to support. So the real challenge is mostly like balance. The question is not simply whether to formalize it or not, but how to improve conditions without removing access. And ultimately, my opinion for this issue would be whether housing policy can upgrade living standards while still preserving affordability and inclusion for lower income groups. So, yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, Mr. Ariful Kabir. Super insightful. As usual, you are our expert on Mumbai. And thank you, Mr. Zumar Sheikh, Miss Sheikh, and Mr. Rana. So, having looked at New York, Toronto, and Mumbai individually, let's now shift into a comparison of these three cases. So, Miss Guest Speaker, Miss Murad, to what extent do the housing crises in New York City, Toronto, and Mumbai arise from fundamentally different causes, such as regulatory supply constraints, demand pressures, and structural inequality? And how can a balanced policy mix be designed to improve affordability across these contrasting contexts?
Thank you for the question, Supreet. So the answer is that the surface causes look different across all three cities, but the deeper cause is identical. New York's crisis is primarily regulatory. Height restrictions limit construction to 2 or 3 stories on 60% of residential land, and that only allows 7% of buildings for 5 stories or more. It's a city of extraordinary density that has legislated against its own capacity to grow. Wait, give me a sec.
Oh, it's all good. She's just facing internet issues. She'll start talking again once she's back. No problem.
So wait, I believe you had a question for me now.
Oh, yes, I did actually. So, is the housing crisis ultimately a failure of supply, a failure of policy, or a reflection of deeper economic inequality across all three cities?
When we look across New York City, Toronto, and Mumbai, the housing crisis appears at first to be a more simple issue of supply and demand, but on closer analysis, it reflects a much deeper structural problem. In cities such as New York, Toronto, rising demand from high-income workers, immigration, and global investment collide with regulatory constraints that limit how quickly housing supply can expand, suggesting a clear failure in both market responsiveness and policy design. However, when we shift our gaze into Mumbai, the issue goes far beyond supply constraints and enters the realm of structural inequality. When large portions of the populations are excluded from the formal housing market altogether, forcing reliance on an informal settlement, this constraint highlights that while supply shortages and policy inefficiencies are critical factors, they do not fully explain why housing remains inaccessible for so many. Instead, the crisis across all three cities ultimately reflect how housing markets allocate resources based on purchasing power rather than need, reinforcing existing inequalities. So the question now becomes not just whether we're building enough housing or just whether the system itself is designed in a way that we can deliver equitable access, or if it inherently prioritizes those with greater economic advantages. I believe our guest speaker's Wi-Fi is now back. I think, would she be open to answering the question that was given before? I apologize for the miscommunication here. I believe that her Wi-Fi is still down. Araf, I would just like
Araf,
to ask.
I would like to ask you a question.
I believe Zohaan can ask this question towards you, Araf.
Yes. So I've been absolutely itching to ask this question to our higher level economics IBDP student, Mr. Mohammed Kabir. Mohammed Ariful Kabir. Sorry, my bad. If policies,
Mohammed Ariful Kabir II.
If policies to increase housing supply and affordability are implemented in New York City, Toronto, and Mumbai, what trade-offs might arise between efficiency, equity, and economic growth, and which objective should policymakers prioritize? I would love to see Mr. Ariful Kabir's insight regarding this question.
Yeah, if policies were to increase housing supply and affordability that are implemented in cities like New York City, Toronto, and Mumbai, the key issue is that improving one objective often comes at the expense of another. From efficiency perspective, increasing supply through faster approvals, relaxed zoning, and more construction would help markets respond better to demand and reduce price distortions. However, this can conflict with equity because new development often benefits higher income groups first, especially in high value urban areas where land is expensive. On the other hand, policies focused on equity, such as rent controls or strong tenant protections, can improve short-term affordability and prevent displacement, but they may also reduce incentives for new construction, which limits long-term supply and can also slow economic growth in the housing sector. So policymakers overall face a whole trade-off, which is first prioritizing efficiency, which can improve long-term supply, but may not immediately help vulnerable groups. Secondly, prioritizing equity can protect existing residents, but may reduce future investment and supply expansion. Ultimately, I feel like there's no perfect balance. The challenge is deciding whether the priority should be maximum affordability today or just sustainable housing growth over time. And that choice depends on how each city defines fairness and long-term development. So, yeah.
I would like to ask a question here. Um, sorry, I'm having difficulties. Araf, thank you so much for the input you gave on all three cities now. I believe our guest speaker's Wi-Fi has now come back online, so I think we should all pay attention, and our viewers at home, to give um, all of our undivided attention to Miss Amelia Murad. Thank you.
Thank you, Zumar. I apologize for the Wi-Fi issues. As I was stating before, New York's crisis is regulatory due to their height restrictions, and the fact that the city is legislated against its own capacity to grow. When we look at Toronto, their crisis is a timing failure. The city is absorbing 2 to 3% annual population growth through a planning system completely incompatible with that pace. The tools to fix it exist, the political will doesn't, because existing homeowners benefit from this scarcity. And Mumbai's crisis runs the deepest because it sits on top of structural inequality the other two cities don't have at the same scale. Millions have been forced into informal settlements with little prospect of formal ownership, and redevelopment models risk displacing those communities rather than genuinely housing them. But what connects all three is that in every city, the people with power over housing policy are the people who profit from the scarcity. The crisis doesn't persist because nobody knows the solution. It persists because the solution requires someone in power to accept a cost. And almost nobody has been willing to pay this cost.
So, to bring this discussion together, what today's conversation highlights is that while New York, Toronto, and Mumbai are all facing housing pressure, the way that pressure manifests depends heavily on structure, policy, and income dynamics. In some ways, the system continues to function, but increasingly becomes expensive. In others, access to the system itself becomes a central issue. And that suggests that the housing crisis isn't just about prices or supply, it's about how housing systems are designed and who they are ultimately able to serve. So before we wrap up today, I'd like to bring you back. Amelia, based on everything we have discussed today, is there anything you would like to say about the Dollar Dialogue podcast?
Thank you, Supreeth. I really enjoyed being a guest speaker on the podcast, and I want to thank you guys for the opportunity for letting me speak. You guys all seem very educated on your topics, and I'm really proud of the podcast that you guys have created. Everyone was beautifully spoken. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Miss Amelia. We would love to
Thank
have
you for your presence in this podcast. So, I think as a whole, speaking for all of the co-hosts, even the one that is absent due to prior commitments, we are very grateful for your presence in this podcast and for your insightful thoughts regarding this problem that affects millions around the world. I believe
The housing crisis forces us to think beyond markets in isolation and toward a broader question of access, equity, and long term sustainability. Thank you again to our beloved guest speaker, Miss Amelia Murad, for joining us today and contributing to such a thoughtful discussion. And thank you to everyone listening. If you found this conversation valuable, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more episodes on Dollar Dialogue. And that's Dollar Dialogue Season 2, Episode 4, The Housing Crisis, New York, Toronto, and Mumbai. Scarcity, Cost, and Control. See you next week for Season 2, Episode 5. And thank you again, our beloved readers. And next week, there's someone's facing internet issues. Please mute their mics. So thank you again to our beloved readers and viewers, listeners. And next week, we are back with a very good episode and a very good guest speaker. That's Dollar Dialogue for now. See you next week.
What is good?